My husband kept a bikini photo of his best friend in his wallet. I kept his house as payback. I was doing laundry last month when my husband Blake's wallet fell out of his jeans. Cash and cards went everywhere. When I picked everything up, this photo fell out from behind his license. It wasn't me or our kids. It was his best friend Jenna from college. Not a group photo, not a casual pic. It was just her, smiling at the camera in a bikini from their recent beach trip. The one I wasn't invited to because it was a college friends thing, even though spouses went. When Blake got home, I asked him about it. He laughed and said I was being insecure, that lots of people keep friend photos in their wallets. I asked how many of his guy friends' photos he had. He called me crazy and slept on the couch to punish me for accusing him. The next morning, Jenna called during breakfast. Blake put her on speaker without asking. She was crying about some guy ghosting her. Blake spent 40 minutes comforting her while our kids' eggs got cold. When I pointed to the food, he waved me off and walked to another room. Our 5-year-old asked why Daddy always talks to Jenna instead of us. That stung. Then I noticed their daily routine. Jenna would text him at 6 a.m. before he even opened his eyes. They'd have entire conversations while I was right there in bed. She'd send selfies asking if she looked cute. He'd respond with heart emojis. When I said it was inappropriate, Blake said I didn't understand friendship because I was too possessive. He actually said maybe if I had friends like Jenna, I'd be less clingy. They had lunch together every Tuesday and Thursday. When I asked to join once, Jenna texted Blake later saying she felt like I was trying to interfere with their bond. Blake told me I needed to apologize for making her uncomfortable. I refused. He didn't talk to me for 3 days. Our anniversary came up. Blake forgot. But that same week, he threw Jenna a massive birthday party at an expensive restaurant. Spent $800 on her gift. Some designer purse she'd mentioned once. My birthday 2 months earlier, he got me a gift card to Target. At the party, Jenna sat on Blake's lap for a photo. When I said that was weird, everyone looked at me like I was the problem. Blake's mom pulled me aside and said I needed to be more secure in my marriage. The breaking point started when Jenna got dumped again. She called Blake sobbing at 2 a.m. on a work night. He actually got dressed and drove to her apartment. Came back at 6 a.m. saying she needed support. Our daughter had a fever that same night. He didn't even know because he was gone. Jenna started coming over every day after that. She'd walk in without knocking, go straight to the fridge, complain about what I cooked. She told Blake I was feeding the kids too much processed food while she made herself a sandwich with my groceries. Blake agreed with her and said I should learn from Jenna since she was so health conscious. She started buying Blake clothes because she said I didn't know his style. Threw out ties I'd gotten him for Christmas right in front of me. Blake wore everything she bought and thanked her for understanding him. When I found them looking at apartments online together, Blake said Jenna needed his help finding a place closer to us. The listing they were viewing was a 2-bedroom. For just her. He said the second room was for when she had guests. Then why were they measuring to see if Blake's desk would fit? I started getting suspicious about their beach trip months earlier. Blake's cousin Ray was there. After some wine, Ray admitted that everyone on the trip thought Blake and Jenna were together. They shared a hotel room to save money while actual couples paid for separate rooms. Ray said Jenna wore Blake's shirts the whole weekend, and they disappeared together multiple times. When I confronted Blake, he said Ray was stirring drama, and I was pathetic for believing gossip. Jenna started planning Blake's birthday party without asking me. Sent invitations from her email. People asked if we'd separated since his girlfriend was planning his party. When I told her to back off, she cried to Blake that I was bullying her. Blake said I was ruining his birthday with my jealousy. He actually asked me to skip the party so Jenna could enjoy herself. I went anyway. Jenna gave a 20-minute speech about their friendship. Inside jokes nobody understood, and memories from college. She ended it saying Blake was her soulmate, and some bonds transcend typical relationships. Everyone clapped uncomfortably. Blake hugged her for a solid minute. The next day, Jenna announced she needed to move in with us. I stood there frozen watching Blake nod along while Jenna explained which bedroom would work best for her. She was gesturing toward the hallway like she already lived here. My hands started shaking so badly I had to clench them into fists. I mumbled something about needing the bathroom and walked away before I screamed at both of them. Inside the bathroom, I locked the door and turned on the fan as loud as it would go. My phone was already in my hand as I scrolled to Fiona's number. She picked up on the second ring. I was crying so hard I could barely get the words out. Jenna wanted to move in. Blake was acting like this was totally normal. Fiona didn't even let me finish explaining before she cut me off and told me to pack a bag right now and come to her place. She said I didn't have to stay there and listen to this insanity. I splashed cold water on my face and took 3 deep breaths. When I came out, Blake and Jenna were sitting on the couch together looking at something on his phone. Probably floor plans for how to rearrange my house for her. I walked straight up to Blake and told him we needed to talk privately. Away from Jenna. He looked annoyed, but he followed me to our bedroom. I closed the door and turned to face him. I told him absolutely not. Jenna was not moving into our family home. Blake's face went red immediately. He said I was being unreasonable. Jenna was going through a hard time and needed support from her best friend. I asked him if he was serious right now. He said completely serious, and that I needed to be more understanding. The argument got louder fast. I was practically yelling that his best friend had been acting like his wife for months, and I was done pretending this was normal. Blake called me jealous and controlling. He said I was trying to destroy his most important friendship. I told him his most important relationship should be with his actual wife and children. He laughed at that. Actually laughed. Blake stormed out of the bedroom and I heard him in the living room telling Jenna everything was fine. He was apologizing for my behavior. Apologizing to her. I stood there for a minute just staring at our bed. Then I grabbed my suitcase from the closet. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I threw clothes into the bag. T-shirts and jeans and underwear all mixed together. I didn't care about folding anything. I just needed to get out of this house. I grabbed the kids' backpacks from their rooms and started filling those too. My daughter's favorite stuffed animal, my son's blanket, toothbrushes from the bathroom. When I came out dragging 2 suitcases and 2 backpacks, Blake's eyes went wide. He asked what I was doing. I told him I was taking the kids to Fiona's house for a few days because I needed space to think. Jenna jumped up from the couch and actually tried to hug me. She said she hoped I felt better soon. Like I was the one with the problem. Like I was sick or something. I pulled away from her and went to get the kids from the playroom. They were confused about why we were leaving. My daughter asked if we were going on a trip. I said we were going to stay with Aunt Fiona for a little while. She asked if Jenna was moving into her room, and I had to bite my lip hard to keep from crying as I buckled her into her car seat. Blake stood in the driveway watching us load up. He looked confused. Actually confused. Like he genuinely could not understand why I was upset. I backed out without saying anything else to him. The drive to Fiona's took 20 minutes. The kids asked questions the whole way, but I couldn't focus on answering them. My brain felt fuzzy. When we pulled up, Fiona was already standing on her porch waiting. She must have been watching for us. She helped me get the kids and bags inside. The kids went straight to her TV room where she had a movie ready for them. Fiona led me to the kitchen and put the kettle on for tea. Then she just let me cry. I sat at her kitchen table with my face in my hands and sobbed for 20 minutes straight. When I finally stopped, Fiona asked what I wanted to do next. I told her I didn't know. I knew I couldn't go back to that house with things the way they were. But I didn't know what came after that. Fiona nodded and poured the tea. My phone started buzzing in my pocket around 8 that night. Blake. I let it go to voicemail. Then he called again. And again. I looked at the texts piling up. Some said he was sorry. Some said I overreacted. One said Jenna left crying because of how I treated her and that I owed her an apology. I turned my phone off and put it in a drawer. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I took the kids to the school like normal so they wouldn't miss anything. Then I drove back to Fiona's and sat at her kitchen table staring at my cold coffee. Fiona sat down across from me and suggested I talk to a lawyer, just to understand my options, even if I wasn't ready to make any decisions yet. The word lawyer made my stomach drop. That made everything feel real in a way it hadn't before. But Fiona was right. I needed to at least know what my options were. I spent the rest of the day on Fiona's laptop looking up divorce attorneys in the area. My eyes started hurting after the first hour, but I kept scrolling through websites and reading reviews. Most of the lawyers charged consultation fees between $200 and $300 just to talk for an hour. I didn't have that kind of money sitting around. Blake handled most of our finances and I had access to our joint account, but taking money out for a divorce lawyer felt wrong somehow, like it would give him ammunition to use against me later. I kept searching until I found an attorney named Miranda Chamberlain, whose website said she offered free initial consultations for family law cases. Her reviews were good and she had been practicing for 15 years. I stared at her phone number on the screen for a solid 10 minutes before I finally called and scheduled an appointment for the next day at 2 in the afternoon. The receptionist asked what the consultation was regarding, and I had to say the word divorce out loud for the first time. It felt heavy coming out of my mouth. That evening around 7, I was helping the kids with a puzzle on Fiona's living room floor when someone started pounding on the front door. Fiona went to answer it, and I heard Blake's voice immediately. He was demanding to talk to me, and his tone made my stomach clench. Fiona told him I wasn't ready to talk right now, but he pushed past her into the house. I stood up from the puzzle as he came into the living room. His face was red and he looked like he hadn't slept. He started talking before I could say anything. He said I was being dramatic and ridiculous, and that we needed to come home right now because the kids needed stability. He actually said stability like he cared about that when he'd been running off to comfort Jenna at all hours for months. I looked at Blake standing there in Fiona's living room, acting like he had any right to demand anything from me. The kids were watching us from the floor, and I didn't want them to see this, but I also couldn't let him keep talking to me like that. I told him the kids needed a father who put them first, instead of running to comfort his best friend at 2 in the morning while his daughter had a fever at home. Blake's face went from red to almost purple, and he said that wasn't fair. He said I was twisting everything to make him look bad. Fiona stepped between us and told Blake he needed to leave right now or she was calling the police. Her voice was calm but firm, and she had her phone already in her hand. Blake looked at her, and then at me, and then at the kids still sitting on the floor with puzzle pieces in their hands. He turned and walked out without another word. We heard his car start up and drive away a minute later. After Blake left, I tried to get the kids back to the puzzle, but they weren't interested anymore. Fiona made them hot chocolate and put on a movie in her den. I sat on the couch feeling shaky and sick. About 20 minutes later, my daughter came out of the bedroom where she was supposed to be sleeping. She was holding her stuffed rabbit and her eyes looked wet. She climbed up on the couch next to me and asked if Daddy loved Jenna more than us. The question hit me so hard I couldn't breathe for a second. My heart felt like it was breaking into actual pieces inside my chest. I pulled her onto my lap and held her tight. I told her that Mommy was going to make sure everything was okay, even though I had absolutely no idea how I was going to do that. She cried into my shoulder and I cried into her hair, and Fiona came and sat with us until my daughter finally fell asleep. The next day, I dropped the kids at the school and drove to Miranda Chamberlain's office. It was in a small building downtown with her name on a brass plate next to the door. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and magazines and a receptionist who smiled at me when I checked in. I sat there for 10 minutes feeling like I might throw up. When Miranda came out to get me, she was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with short dark hair and a no-nonsense handshake. She led me back to her office and gestured to a chair across from her desk. She asked me to tell her why I was there, and I started talking. She took notes while I explained about the bikini photo and the daily texts and the forgotten anniversary and the $800 purse. She asked questions about our finances and the house and Blake's relationship with Jenna. When I mentioned that the house came from my grandmother's inheritance and was only in my name, her eyebrows went up. She made a note and underlined it twice. Miranda put down her pen and looked at me directly. She explained that because the house was my separate property from before the marriage, Blake had no legal claim to it at all. If we got divorced, I would keep the house and Blake would have to leave. The information hit me like someone had punched me in the stomach, but in a good way. I had power here that I didn't even know I had. Miranda kept talking, and I tried to focus on her words. She said that in our state, property owned before marriage or inherited during marriage stays with the original owner unless it gets mixed with marital property. Since I'd kept the house in only my name and we'd never refinanced or anything like that, it was completely mine. Blake would have no right to it or to any of its value. I told Miranda everything else I could think of. The Target gift card for my birthday while Jenna got designer purses. The shared hotel room on the beach trip that I wasn't invited to. Jenna's speech at Blake's birthday party calling him her soulmate while everyone watched uncomfortably. Miranda wrote it all down and said it showed a clear pattern of Blake prioritizing Jenna over the marriage. She used the term emotional abandonment and said we could use that if we went to court. She explained that emotional affairs were harder to prove than physical ones, but the pattern of behavior I was describing was pretty obvious. The money he spent on Jenna while neglecting me. The time he spent with her while ignoring the kids. The 2 a.m. visits when our daughter was sick. It all added up to a husband who had checked out of his marriage. Miranda leaned back in her chair and laid out my options in a way that felt both scary and clear. She said I could try marriage counseling if I wanted to save the relationship. Some couples did manage to work through this kind of thing if both people were willing to change. But she also said I could file for divorce and would likely get primary custody of the kids given Blake's pattern of leaving them to attend to Jenna. She said the choice was completely mine, but I should think carefully about what I wanted my life to look like going forward. Did I want to spend years trying to compete with Jenna for my own husband's attention? Or did I want to build a life where I didn't have to do that anymore? She didn't push me either way, but her questions made me really think about what I wanted. I drove back to Fiona's house in a daze. For the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe all the way. Just knowing I had options and legal standing made me feel less trapped. I wasn't stuck in this situation with no way out. I had a house in my name and a lawyer who understood what was happening and laws that would protect me and the kids. When I got back, Fiona was making lunch and she asked how it went. I told her Miranda was great and that I was meeting with her again next week to discuss next steps. Fiona hugged me and said she was proud of me for taking action. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that until she said it. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Blake. He asked when we were coming home and said Jenna was very hurt by my accusations. I stared at that text for a long time. Even now, even after everything, he was worried about Jenna's feelings. Not mine, not the kids, Jenna's. I texted back that I would come get more clothes for me and the kids, but we weren't moving back in until he agreed to marriage counseling and set serious boundaries with Jenna. Real boundaries, not the fake ones where she still texted him constantly and came over whenever she wanted. Blake's response came back fast. You're being ridiculous. That was it. Nothing else. No agreement to counseling, no acknowledgement that maybe he needed to change something. Just me being ridiculous for having basic expectations in my own marriage. I put my phone down and didn't pick it up again for the rest of the night. I waited until Blake's car pulled out of the driveway before I grabbed my keys. The house looked different when I walked in, like something had shifted even though everything was in the same place. Dishes covered the kitchen counter and filled the sink, crusted with food from at least 3 days. The smell hit me when I got closer. Something sour and rotten from the garbage that hadn't been taken out. Blake's work shirts were piled on the couch where he'd thrown them, and I could see into our bedroom where the sheets were tangled and half off the bed. He couldn't even manage basic cleaning without me there to do it for him. I walked through each room taking inventory of what I needed. Birth certificates and social security cards went into my bag first, then the kids' medical records from the filing cabinet. I pulled photo albums off the shelf in the living room, the ones with pictures of the kids as babies and my grandmother's old photos that I'd never want Blake to have. My hands moved on autopilot, grabbing things methodically while my brain stayed numb. I was folding clothes in the bedroom when I heard the front door open. My whole body went cold because Blake wasn't supposed to be home for hours. But it wasn't Blake's footsteps I heard coming down the hall. Jenna walked into the bedroom holding a bag of groceries like she lived here. Her face went through about 5 different expressions when she saw me standing there with my suitcase open on the bed. She recovered fast, though, putting on this concerned look that made my skin crawl. She opened her mouth to say something about Blake needing help or support or whatever excuse she'd come up with. I held up my hand and cut her off before she could get the words out. I told her to give me the key to my house right now. My voice came out flat and hard, nothing like the polite tone I'd used with her for years. Jenna's hand went to her pocket and she clutched something there, her eyes going wide like I'd asked her to cut off her own arm. She said Blake gave her the key so she could check on him, that I was abandoning him when he needed support the most. The words came out fast and defensive, like she'd practiced this speech. I held out my hand and didn't move. I told her she had 10 seconds to put that key in my palm, or I was calling the police and reporting her for trespassing in my house. I started counting out loud. 1, 2, 3. Jenna's face went red and she fumbled with her keychain, her fingers shaking as she worked the house key off the ring. She practically threw it on the dresser instead of handing it to me, then turned and walked out without another word. I heard the front door slam hard enough to rattle the windows. I picked up the key and put it in my pocket, then went back to packing like nothing had happened. My phone started ringing 20 minutes later while I was loading boxes into my car. Blake's name flashed on the screen and I knew Jenna had called him the second she got to her car. I answered and pulled the phone away from my ear because he was already screaming before I could say hello. He yelled about how I threatened his best friend and made her cry, how I had no right to take her key when she was just trying to help him through this difficult time. I waited for him to take a breath, and then I told him very clearly that I would not tolerate another woman having a key to my house and coming and going whenever she wanted. He called me controlling and jealous, said Jenna was just trying to be supportive and I was punishing her for being a good friend. I hung up while he was still talking and blocked his number for the rest of the day. Back at Fiona's house that night, I sat at her kitchen table while the kids watched a movie in the other room. Fiona made us both tea and sat across from me, her hands wrapped around her mug. She asked me what I really wanted, not what Blake wanted or what would make everyone else happy, but what I actually wanted for my life. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't know. She leaned forward and asked if I thought Blake would actually change, if marriage counseling could fix what was broken between us. I thought about the bikini photo in his wallet and the $800 purse he bought Jenna and the 2 a.m. drives to her apartment. I thought about how he'd never once chosen me over her, not in any moment that mattered. I told Fiona I didn't believe he would change because he didn't think anything was wrong. He saw Jenna as his best friend, and me as the jealous wife trying to ruin it. That wasn't something a counselor could fix because Blake didn't want it fixed. Fiona nodded like she'd been waiting for me to figure that out. She asked what I was going to do, and I told her I didn't know yet, but I knew I couldn't go back to living like that. The next morning, I woke up with this clarity I hadn't felt in months. I waited until 9 o'clock when I knew Miranda would be in her office. Then I called her number with my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone. When she answered, I told her I wanted to move forward with the divorce. My voice cracked on the word divorce, but I got it out. Miranda's tone shifted into business mode immediately. She said she'd start drafting the paperwork and we'd file within the week, that I was making the right choice for myself and my kids. After I hung up, I sat there staring at my phone for a long time. It felt real now in a way it hadn't before. 2 days later, I met with a real estate appraiser at the house. His name was Warren Howell, and he showed up exactly on time with a clipboard and a camera. He walked through every room taking measurements and photos, making notes about the updated kitchen and the new roof I'd paid for last year with my inheritance money. He asked questions about when things were renovated and what improvements had been made. When he finished, he sat down at the kitchen table to go over his findings. The number he gave me for the house value made me blink twice. The neighborhood had gone up in value way more than I realized, and with all the improvements, the house was worth almost double what I thought. Warren printed out his preliminary report and handed it to me, saying the full appraisal would be ready in a few days. Blake found out about the appraiser somehow, probably from a neighbor who saw Warren's car in the driveway. 3 hours after Warren left, Blake showed up at Fiona's house again. I heard his car pull up and looked out the window to see Jenna sitting in the passenger seat. My stomach dropped. Blake got out and marched up to the front door, pounding on it hard enough that Fiona's dog started barking. I went to the door but didn't open it, just talked through it and asked what he wanted. He demanded to know what I was planning and why I had someone appraising our house. I told him he'd find out soon enough when he got served with papers. His face went purple through the window in the door. He started yelling about how I couldn't just take his house, that he had rights too. I reminded him the house was never his. It was mine from my grandmother, and he knew that when we got married. Then Jenna got out of the car. She actually walked up to Fiona's front door and started yelling that I was a horrible wife who didn't appreciate Blake, that he'd given me everything and I was throwing it away over nothing. Her voice got louder and more shrill with every word. Fiona came up behind me and opened the door just wide enough to stick her head out. She told Jenna that if she didn't get off her property immediately, she was calling the police for harassment. Blake grabbed Jenna's arm and pulled her back toward the car. She was still yelling as he shoved her into the passenger seat. They drove off with Jenna's face pressed against the window, her mouth still moving. The divorce papers were ready 3 days later. Miranda called me to come to her office and walked me through every page. She pointed out the sections requesting primary custody, with Blake getting standard visitation every other weekend and 1 evening per week. The papers stated I was keeping the house as my separate property since it came from my inheritance before the marriage. We'd split the small amount of savings in our joint account and each keep our own cars. Miranda explained that a process server would deliver the papers to Blake at his workplace the next day, that serving him at work was standard procedure, and would create a legal record of when he received them. I signed everywhere she pointed and my hand cramped up by the last page. Miranda put all the documents in a folder and told me to expect Blake to react badly, that I should stay at Fiona's and not answer his calls for at least a few days. She said his lawyer would contact her and they'd handle everything from there. I drove back to Fiona's house feeling like I was watching myself from outside my body. Everything felt surreal and too fast and exactly right all at the same time. That night I couldn't sleep. Just kept checking my phone even though Miranda said the server wouldn't go until the next afternoon. I I made breakfast for the kids the next morning and got them off to the school like it was a normal day. Then I sat on Fiona's couch and waited. Miranda texted me at 2 in the afternoon with just 3 words confirming Blake had been served. I stared at that text for a full minute before my hands started shaking. 20 minutes later, my phone started ringing with Blake's number over and over. I didn't answer. He left 7 voicemails in the first hour, his voice getting more angry and desperate with each one. The first one was him yelling about how I couldn't do this to him. The 4th one was him crying and begging me to call him back. The 7th one was him saying his lawyer was going to destroy me in court. I deleted all of them without listening to the whole messages. Blake's mom called that evening and I made the mistake of answering. She tore into me immediately, saying I was destroying her son's life and breaking up the family. She said Blake deserved half the house because he'd lived there and been a good husband. I told her very calmly that the house was legally mine from my grandmother's estate, and Blake had no claim to it. She called me selfish and said I was using money to punish Blake for having a close friend. I explained that Blake's close friend sat on his lap at parties and had a key to my house and planned his birthday without me. His mom said I was exaggerating everything and that I needed to be more secure. I hung up on her and blocked her number too. The next few days were a nightmare of Blake's family members calling to yell at me or beg me to reconsider. I blocked them one by one until my phone finally went quiet. Blake only sent text messages for the next 2 days. I kept my phone on silent, but I could see the notifications stacking up on my screen. He sent long paragraphs about how I was overreacting, and shorter ones begging me to answer him. Some messages blamed me for being jealous. Others said he missed the kids. None of them mentioned changing anything about Jenna. I forwarded a few to Miranda when she asked for documentation of his communication patterns. She said his messages showed he still didn't understand the problem, which would help our case if we needed it. Blake's family started calling on day 3. His brother left a voicemail saying I was tearing the family apart over nothing. His sister sent a text with crying emojis asking me to think about the kids. I deleted most of the messages without reading them fully because I knew what they'd say. Blake's mom called while I was making dinner for the kids, and I answered without thinking. She started yelling immediately about how I was destroying her son and breaking up the family over my insecurity. She said Blake deserved half the house because he'd lived there and been a good provider. I stirred the pasta with one hand and held the phone away from my ear with the other. She kept going about how selfish I was being, and how Blake just had a close friendship that I couldn't handle. I waited for her to take a breath, and then I explained very slowly that the house came from my grandmother's estate before Blake and I got married. It was legally mine alone, and Blake had no claim to it regardless of how long he'd lived there. She called me a greedy witch and said I was using money to punish Blake for having friends. I told her that Blake's friend sat on his lap at parties and had a key to my house and planned his birthday without consulting his wife. His mom said I was exaggerating everything to play the victim, while she was mid-sentence and blocked her number. My hands shook while I drained the pasta, and I had to sit down for a minute before I could plate the food for the kids. Blake's aunt called the next morning. His uncle called that afternoon. His cousin sent a long email about family loyalty and forgiveness. Each one had a slightly different approach, but the message was the same. I was being unreasonable and I needed to come home and work things out. I blocked the aunt and uncle immediately. I read the cousin's email once and then deleted it. Miranda told me to keep a log of everyone who contacted me and what they said, so I started a document on my laptop with dates and times and brief summaries. By the end of the week, I had 17 entries. Blake sent an email to my work address since I wasn't responding to his texts anymore. He said I was ruining his life and making everything harder than it needed to be. He said Jenna was helping him find a good attorney because she actually cared about him getting through this. I forwarded that email to Miranda with the subject line, Exhibit A. She replied with a thumbs up emoji and said Blake was building our case for us. The kids asked about going home every single day. My son wanted his toys from his room. My daughter missed her bed. They didn't understand why we were still at Aunt Fiona's house when we were only supposed to stay a few days. I sat them down on Fiona's couch on Saturday morning and tried to explain in words they could understand. I said Mommy and Daddy were having grown-up problems, and we needed to live separately for a while. My son asked if we were getting divorced like his friend's parents. I said maybe, that we were figuring things out. My daughter looked at me with her big eyes and asked if it was because of Jenna. I froze because I didn't know how to answer that honestly without making Blake look bad to his own kids. I told her it was complicated, and that Daddy and I had different ideas about what a marriage should look like. She nodded like she understood, but I could tell she didn't really. My son asked if we'd ever go home, and I promised him we would, that our house was still ours and we'd be back there soon. I didn't tell them that when we went back, their dad wouldn't be living there anymore. Miranda called me the following Tuesday with news. Blake's attorney had sent a response to our divorce filing. She read parts of it to me over the phone, and I could hear the amusement in her voice. Blake's lawyer was demanding he get half the value of the house and claiming he'd contributed to mortgage payments during the marriage. Miranda actually laughed and said she'd been hoping they'd try this angle. She explained that she had all the documentation showing the house was paid off completely with my inheritance money before Blake and I even got engaged. There had never been a mortgage for him to contribute to. The house was my separate property under state law, and his attorney had no legal ground to stand on. She said Blake's lawyer was either incompetent or desperate or both. I felt relief wash over me. So strongly I had to sit down. Miranda said she'd send a response with all the proof and shut down that argument immediately. She told me not to worry because Blake's case was falling apart before it even really started. 2 weeks crawled by with me staying at Fiona's and managing the kids' schedules and trying to keep everything normal for them. Blake texted on a Thursday afternoon asking if we could meet in person without lawyers. He said he just wanted to talk and see if we could work things out before this got even messier. I called Miranda to ask what I should do. She advised me to only communicate through attorneys from now on, and not to meet with Blake alone. I sat with her advice for a few hours, but something in me needed to see him face to face one more time. I needed to look him in the eye and see if there was any part of the man I married who understood what he'd done to our family. I texted Blake back and agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown the next day at noon. I picked a busy place with lots of windows and people around. Miranda wasn't happy when I told her, but she said to keep my phone recording in my pocket just in case. I got to the coffee shop 15 minutes early and sat at a table near the window where I could see the door. Blake walked in right at noon looking worse than I'd ever seen him. He hadn't shaved in days and his clothes were wrinkled like he'd slept in them. He had dark circles under his eyes and his hair stuck up in the back. He saw me and walked over slowly like he wasn't sure I'd really be there. He sat down across from me and immediately started talking about how much he missed me and the kids. He said the house felt empty without us, and he couldn't sleep in our bed because it reminded him of me. He begged me to drop the divorce and come home. He said he'd do anything to fix this and make our family whole again. I watched him talk and felt nothing, but sadness for how pathetic he looked. I asked him one question. Would he cut off all contact with Jenna completely and go to real marriage counseling with me? He opened his mouth to answer and then closed it again. He looked down at his coffee cup and I watched him struggle with the answer for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 seconds. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Blake finally said he could set better boundaries with Jenna, but she was his best friend, and he couldn't just abandon her when she needed him. He said it wouldn't be fair to end a friendship that had lasted since college just because I felt threatened by it. I told him very clearly that he'd already abandoned his wife and children for her. He'd left our daughter sick with a fever to comfort Jenna at 2 a.m. He'd forgotten our anniversary but spent $800 on Jenna's birthday present. He'd let her plan his birthday party and give a speech about being his soulmate while I sat there humiliated. I said I was done competing for last place in my own marriage, and I was done pretending his relationship with Jenna was normal friendship. Blake's eyes filled with tears, and he reached across the table to grab my hand. He said I was being cruel and unfair, that I was making him choose between two people he cared about. I pulled my hand away and stood up. I told him he'd already made his choice every single day for months, and I was just finally accepting it. I walked out of the coffee shop and didn't look back. Blake texted me 3 hours later. The message said Jenna was helping him get through this hard time, and she'd been more supportive than I ever was. She understood him in ways I never could, and she was proving to be a real friend when he needed one most. I read the text twice and then took a screenshot of it. I opened my email and sent the screenshot to Miranda with a short message saying, this showed exactly where Blake's priorities were. Miranda replied within minutes saying this was perfect evidence and to save any other messages like this. I felt sad but also certain I'd made the right choice. Blake was never going to change and I was never going to be enough for him as long as Jenna was in the picture. The kids had a terrible week after that. My daughter got in trouble at the school for pushing another kid on the playground. The teacher called me in for a meeting and I had to explain that we were going through a family separation, and my daughter was struggling with the changes. The teacher was understanding, but said my daughter had been acting out in class too, not following directions and talking back to adults. I apologized and promised to work with her at home. The school counselor came into the meeting and offered to see my daughter once a week to help her process everything that was happening. I agreed immediately because I knew I couldn't help her work through this on my own. My daughter cried when I picked her up from the school that day. She said she was sorry for being bad and she just wanted everything to go back to normal. I held her in the car for 20 minutes while she sobbed into my shoulder. I promised her that things would get better, even though I wasn't totally sure that was true. I just knew I had to believe it for her sake. My daughter cried herself to sleep that night and I sat on the edge of her bed watching her chest rise and fall. The school counselor's card sat on my nightstand, and I knew I'd be calling first thing in the morning. Fiona knocked softly on the door and gestured for me to come out to the living room where she had 2 mugs of tea waiting. She didn't say anything, just handed me one and sat down next to me on the couch. I took a sip and felt the warmth spread through my chest, but it didn't touch the cold knot in my stomach. My phone buzzed with another text from Blake asking when we were coming home, and I turned it face down on the coffee table. Fiona reached over and squeezed my hand and told me I was doing the right thing, that my daughter would be okay, that kids were tough. I wanted to believe her, but all I could see was my little girl's face asking if Daddy loved someone else more than us. Miranda called me 2 days later with news that made my stomach drop. Blake's lawyer had filed a response to our divorce papers claiming Blake deserved spousal support because I was keeping the house. I sat down hard on Fiona's kitchen chair and asked how that was even possible when the house was mine from my grandmother. Miranda's voice was calm and steady as she explained that Blake's lawyer was grasping at straws, trying to find any angle that might work. She said she'd already started putting together documentation of Blake's income, his spending patterns, and the $800 purse he bought for another woman while giving me a Target gift card. She told me about the evidence we had of his emotional abandonment, the 2 a.m. trips to comfort his best friend while our daughter had a fever, the constant prioritizing of someone else over his family. Miranda said Blake's lawyer would see all of this, and the spousal support request would disappear fast. I thanked her and hung up feeling shaky, but also grateful that someone was fighting for me with actual legal knowledge and strategy. The documentation Miranda sent over was brutal to read. She'd compiled bank statements showing every lunch Blake bought for another woman, every gift, every dinner. The pattern was so clear when you saw it all laid out like that. He'd spent thousands on someone who wasn't his wife while our kids needed new shoes, and I was clipping coupons for groceries. Miranda had also included text message records showing the constant communication, the heart emojis, the selfies asking if she looked cute. She'd highlighted the 2 a.m. timestamp on the night he left our sick daughter to comfort his best friend. The packet was 50 pages long, and it told the story of a man who'd checked out of his marriage completely. 3 days later, Miranda called to say Blake's lawyer had withdrawn the spousal support request without explanation. I felt a surge of satisfaction knowing they'd seen the evidence and realized they had no case. I started looking for a new job the next week because my current hours wouldn't work for single parenting. I needed something with flexibility for school pickups and sick days, and all the things Blake used to theoretically help with, even though he was usually too busy with his best friend. Fiona helped me update my resume at her kitchen table, asking questions about my work history and skills that I'd forgotten I even had. She made me practice answering interview questions until I stopped sounding apologetic for needing reasonable hours. It felt good to focus on something forward-looking instead of just surviving each day. I applied to 6 different positions over 2 weeks and got 3 callbacks. The third interview was with a company that specifically advertised flexible scheduling for working parents, and the manager interviewing me was a single mom herself. She understood immediately when I explained my situation and said they valued employees who were honest about their needs. I left that interview feeling hopeful for the first time in months. Blake's lawyer sent over a proposed custody schedule a week later, and I stared at it in disbelief. He wanted the kids every single weekend, Friday after school through Sunday night. Miranda called me after I'd emailed her the proposal, and I could hear the annoyance in her voice even though she stayed professional. She said that was not standard and we'd be countering with every other weekend plus 1 evening per week for dinner. I asked if Blake could actually get more time than that given everything that had happened, and Miranda said his lawyer could try to argue for it. But we had strong grounds to limit his time. She reminded me about the pattern of him leaving the kids to attend to his best friend, the forgotten appointments, the times he'd been physically present but emotionally checked out. She said judges looked at what was actually best for the children, not what the parent wanted, and a parent who'd consistently put someone else first wasn't going to get maximum custody time. The kids came back from their first overnight visit with Blake, and my daughter seemed quiet and withdrawn. I made her favorite dinner and tried to get her to talk about the weekend, but she just pushed her food around her plate. Finally, after her brother went to play, she looked up at me with big worried eyes and said Daddy let his friend come over to his new apartment. My heart started pounding and I asked which friend, even though I already knew. She said the lady who wanted to live in her room, the one who was always at our old house. I kept my voice calm and asked what happened when the lady was there. My daughter said she made them lunch and told them she was going to be like a bonus mom and that they'd do lots of fun things together. I felt sick to my stomach, but I smiled at my daughter and told her she did nothing wrong by telling me. As soon as she went to bed, I called Miranda and left a message saying we had a problem. Miranda called back within an hour, even though it was late. I explained what my daughter had told me, and Miranda was quiet for a moment before saying we needed to file a motion immediately to restrict Blake from having his best friend around during parenting time. She said judges took these situations seriously, especially when a third party had been the source of marital problems and was now trying to insert herself into the children's lives without any legal relationship to them. We spent 30 minutes on the phone while Miranda took detailed notes about exactly what my daughter had said. She told me to write down everything I remembered while it was fresh and send it to her first thing in the morning. I sat at Fiona's kitchen table after we hung up and wrote 3 pages of notes, my hands shaking as I tried to capture every word my daughter had used. The court hearing happened faster than I expected. Miranda filed our emergency motion and we got a date within 2 weeks. I sat in the courtroom next to Miranda while Blake and his lawyer sat across the aisle. Blake looked angry and kept whispering to his lawyer, who nodded and took notes. The judge was a woman in her 50s who looked tired but alert as she read through our motion. Miranda stood up and explained the situation clearly and calmly, talking about how the third party had been the source of conflict in the marriage and was now trying to position herself as a parental figure to children she had no legal relationship with. Blake's lawyer argued that his client had a right to have friends in his life and that we were trying to isolate him. The judge looked at Blake and asked directly if the woman in question had been present during his parenting time. Blake hesitated and then admitted she had stopped by briefly. The judge's expression didn't change, but she made a note on her papers. She said she was granting a temporary order that Blake could not have this specific person present during his custody time until a full hearing could be scheduled. Blake's face went red and his lawyer started to object, but the judge cut him off and said, introducing a third party who'd been the source of marital conflict was not in the children's best interest at this time. I felt Miranda's hand squeeze my arm under the table. Blake sent me an email that night and I knew before opening it that it would be bad. He wrote that I was poisoning the kids against his best friend, and that they needed to get used to her being in his life because she wasn't going anywhere. He said I was being cruel and manipulative and using the children as weapons. He said his best friend had been nothing but kind to the kids and wanted to build a relationship with them. He wrote 3 full paragraphs about how she understood him better than I ever had, and how she was helping him through the hardest time of his life. I read it twice and then forwarded it to Miranda without typing a single word in response. Every message he sent just proved that she remained his priority over his own children, over being a good father, over everything else in his life. 3 months crawled by with court dates and lawyer calls and custody exchanges. Blake showed up late twice to pick up the kids, and I documented it with timestamps and texts. The kids came back saying Daddy seemed sad all the time, but at least the lady wasn't there anymore. Miranda kept me updated on negotiations, and slowly we got closer to final terms. Blake's lawyer finally told him he had no legal standing to fight for the house because it was my separate property from before the marriage. Miranda called me with the news that we were close to finalizing everything. I'd keep the house in primary custody. Blake would get every other weekend and Wednesday dinners, and we'd split the small savings account we'd had. It wasn't much money, but I didn't care. I just wanted it to be over. I took the kids back to our house on a Saturday morning when I knew Blake was at work. They burst out of the car and ran up the front steps like they'd been holding their breath for months. My daughter ran straight to her room, and I heard her squeal with happiness that her stuff was still there. My son ran through every room touching things like he needed to make sure they were real. I walked through, slowly taking in the space that was mine now. Really mine. Not shared with someone who didn't want to be there. The first thing I did was call a locksmith, and he came out that same afternoon. I watched him change every lock on every door, and when he handed me the new keys, it felt like more than just metal. It felt like safety. It felt like this was our home now. Protected and secure, and nobody could walk in uninvited ever again. Blake had to come get his stuff the following week, and I made sure I wasn't there for it. Fiona agreed to supervise and make sure he only took his personal belongings, and nothing that belonged to me or the kids. I took the kids to a movie and kept my phone in my purse even though I wanted to check it every 5 minutes. When we got back to Fiona's house, she was already there with a small smile on her face. She said it went fine. Blake took his clothes and some furniture we'd agreed on, and he'd been professional about the whole thing. Then she paused and added that his best friend had been with him helping him pack. I wasn't surprised at all. Of course she was there. She'd probably helped him decide what to take. She'd probably walked through my house like she'd always wanted to, finally getting to be there without me in the way. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in a courtroom with just our lawyers present. I didn't have to see Blake or sit near him or hear his voice. Miranda and his lawyer worked out the last details with the judge, and then it was done. Miranda found me in the hallway after and shook my hand firmly and told me I did great, that I'd handled everything with strength and dignity. I thanked her and paid her final bill and walked out of the courthouse into bright morning sunshine. I got to my car and sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the steering wheel. The divorce decree was in my bag. The house keys were in my pocket. My kids were at the school having a normal day. I was officially single and officially a homeowner, and officially done with a marriage that had been over long before I'd found that bikini photo in a wallet. I put my head down on the steering wheel and cried for 20 minutes straight, big, ugly sobs that shook my whole body. I cried for the marriage I'd thought I had. I cried for my kids who deserved better. I cried because I was relieved and sad and scared and free all at the same time. I picked up paint samples at the hardware store the next weekend. The kids came with me and my daughter grabbed every purple swatch she could find while my son debated between blue and green for his room. We spent an hour holding different colors up to the walls in each room, making a game of it. My daughter insisted on the brightest purple they had, and I didn't argue because seeing her excited about her space felt more important than my taste. We painted her room first on a Saturday morning with the windows open and music playing. She helped roll paint on the lower half of the walls while I did the higher parts. When we finished, she stood in the doorway staring at her bright purple walls with the biggest smile. Then she ran to the linen closet and pulled out sheets I'd bought her the day before, also purple with little stars on them. While I made up her bed with the new bedding, she said she was glad Jenna wasn't going to live in her room after all. I hugged her tight and told her this room was all hers and nobody else's. Blake picked up the kids for his first official weekend 2 weeks later. He showed up 20 minutes late without calling and barely apologized when I opened the door. The kids grabbed their overnight bags and climbed into his car while I stood on the porch documenting the pickup time in my phone. The next weekend he was late again, this time by almost an hour. I called his cell 3 times before he answered, saying he'd lost track of time. When the kids came home Sunday night, my daughter was quiet and my son seemed distracted. I asked how their weekend was, and my daughter shrugged and said, "Daddy seemed sad the whole time." My son added that Jenna was there a lot even though she wasn't supposed to be. I kept my face calm and asked what they meant by a lot. My daughter said Jenna made them breakfast both mornings and watched movies with them on the couch. My son said Jenna helped Daddy make dinner and stayed until bedtime. I wrote down everything they said word for word in a notebook I kept specifically for custody documentation. I called Miranda the next morning and told her what the kids had reported. She asked me to have them write down or draw pictures of what happened during their visits if they were comfortable doing that. My daughter drew a picture of the 3 of them at Daddy's apartment with Jenna standing between Blake and the kids. My son wrote a simple list of activities that included Jenna's name in almost every item. Miranda said this was enough to file another motion, and she'd get the paperwork started immediately. Blake's lawyer responded claiming Jenna only stopped by briefly to drop off groceries and that the kids were exaggerating. But when the court-appointed child advocate interviewed my daughter separately, she told him that Jenna was there for entire visits, making them meals and watching movies with them. She said Jenna tried to act like their mom and it made her uncomfortable. The advocate included this information in his report to the judge. The hearing happened on a Thursday morning in the same courtroom where our divorce was finalized. Blake sat at his table looking annoyed while his lawyer shuffled papers. The judge read through the child advocate's report and then asked Blake directly if Jenna had been present during his parenting time. Blake started to answer, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm and spoke for him, saying there may have been some brief visits. The judge looked up from the papers with a stern expression and said the previous order was clear that introducing the third party who caused marital conflict was not appropriate during this transition period. Then he modified the order to be even more specific, stating that Jenna could not be at Blake's residence at all during his parenting time, and that violations would result in supervised visitation only. Blake's face went red and he started to stand up, but his lawyer grabbed his arm and whispered something that made him sit back down. The judge asked if Blake understood the order, and Blake nodded without saying anything. I started my new job the following Monday at a marketing firm downtown. The pay was better than my previous position, and my boss made it clear during the interview that she understood single-parent scheduling needs. My first week was busy learning new systems and meeting coworkers, but I felt energized instead of drained when I came home. The flexible hours meant I could do school pickup most days and work from home when the kids were sick. On my third day, my boss stopped by my desk and asked how I was settling in. I told her great and thanked her for the opportunity. She smiled and said she could tell I was going to be an asset to the team. Driving home that evening, I realized this job felt like more than just a paycheck. It felt like I was building a life that belonged to me now, not a life where I managed everyone else's needs while mine got ignored. The kids settled into their routine over the next few months. Every other weekend they went to Blake's apartment, and every Wednesday he picked them up for dinner. My daughter still had rough days where she asked why Daddy didn't live with us anymore, but the school counselor said she was adjusting well considering everything. My son threw fewer tantrums and started sleeping through the night again. The counselor met with them weekly and reported that they understood their parents weren't getting back together, and were learning to accept their new normal. My daughter stopped asking about Jenna as much, and when she did mention her, it was usually to say something Jenna did that annoyed her. I never asked follow-up questions or encouraged negativity, but I noticed my daughter seemed relieved that Jenna wasn't around our house anymore. Blake's mother showed up at my door on a Saturday afternoon without calling first. I was in the middle of making lunch when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find her standing on my porch with a tight smile asking if she could see her grandchildren. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me so the kids wouldn't hear. I told her calmly that she was welcome to see the kids, but she needed to schedule visits in advance, and that I wouldn't tolerate any criticism of me in front of them. She huffed and said I was being controlling and that she had a right to see her grandchildren whenever she wanted. I repeated that she could see them but only during scheduled visits, and only if she agreed to be respectful. She stared at me for a long moment, then said fine and asked when would be convenient. We agreed on the following Sunday afternoon, and she left looking unhappy, but she called first the next week like I'd asked. 6 months after filing for divorce, I sat in my living room on a Tuesday evening watching the kids play a board game on the floor. The house was quiet except for their laughter, and the occasional argument over game rules. Blake's phone wasn't buzzing constantly on the coffee table because Blake wasn't there. Jenna wasn't texting pictures asking if she looked cute. Nobody was interrupting our family time to comfort someone else. We'd eaten dinner together at the kitchen table without anyone walking away mid-meal to take a call. My daughter had told me about her day at the school, and my son had shown me a drawing he made without competing for attention. I looked around at our home with its freshly painted walls and rearranged furniture, and realized I felt peaceful for the first time in years. Not happy exactly because divorce and single parenting were hard, but peaceful in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I heard through a mutual friend the following week that Blake and Jenna were officially dating now. The friend seemed hesitant to tell me like she thought I'd be upset, but I just nodded and said I wasn't surprised. She asked if I was okay, and I told her honestly that I felt relieved more than anything. Part of me wanted to feel angry that everything I'd suspected was true, and that Blake had probably been emotionally involved with Jenna the whole time. But mostly I just felt glad I wasn't in that situation anymore. Glad I wasn't the wife being pushed aside while her husband prioritized his best friend. They could have each other and whatever messy relationship they'd built while destroying my marriage. I had my house and my kids and my peace. My daughter brought home a drawing from the school the next week that the teacher had assigned about family. She'd drawn 3 figures in front of a house with a purple roof. It was her brother, and me. The house had flowers in front and a sun in the corner. I looked at the drawing for a long time before asking where Daddy was. She shrugged and said she drew our real family, the people who live together. My heart broke a little because no kid should have to think about their family being split up, but it also showed me that she understood our new reality and had accepted it in her own way. I hung the drawing on the refrigerator next to her purple bedroom photo and a picture of the 3 of us at the park from last weekend. A few weeks later, Blake's lawyer sent an email asking if he could have the kids for an extra week during summer vacation. I read it twice, considering my options. The kids needed time with their dad, and refusing would only hurt them. I typed out my response carefully, saying yes, but adding that Jenna could not be present at any point during that week per the court order. His lawyer replied within an hour confirming Blake understood and would comply. I printed the email exchange and added it to my growing file of documentation, just in case. Fiona mentioned a support group for divorced parents that met Thursday evenings at a community center downtown. I almost didn't go because the idea of sitting in a circle talking about my failed marriage sounded terrible. But I showed up anyway and found 12 other people in folding chairs drinking bad coffee. A woman named Sarah shared about her ex getting half their house even though he cheated with their neighbor. She looked directly at me when she said I was lucky to have the house in my name already. Another dad talked about his kids refusing to see him because his girlfriend moved in too fast. I didn't share much that first night, just listened. But driving home, I felt less alone than I had in months. On Saturday morning, I took the kids to the garden center and let them pick out vegetable seeds and flower bulbs. My daughter chose tomatoes and sunflowers while my son wanted carrots because he liked the color orange. Blake always said gardening was too much work, and that we should just buy produce at the store. We spent the afternoon in the backyard digging holes and planting everything in neat rows. My daughter insisted on naming each plant as we put it in the ground. She called the biggest tomato plant Gerald and a sunflower Susan. When we finished and stood looking at our work, she grabbed my hand and said this was her favorite house now because it was just ours. A year had passed since that bikini photo fell out of Blake's wallet and turned my whole life sideways. I tucked the kids into bed in our house, my house, reading them one more chapter before turning out the light. Single parenting exhausted me most days, and money stayed tight no matter how carefully I budgeted. But I wasn't competing for my own husband's attention anymore. The kids were doing better in the school, making new friends, laughing more at dinner. I had a job I actually liked, and we were building traditions that belonged only to us. Blake still took the kids every other weekend, and Jenna apparently lived with him now, which just proved I made the right choice. I kept the house and got my self-respect back, and that was worth more than any marriage that required me to accept second place.